So ordinands to the Episcopal priesthood all around the country have just finished taking their general ordination exams, which is a marathon of 3 days of 3-hour-long essays over and over again, 7 questions. They give you a question and maybe a Bible and tell you to answer it for an hour and a half. And I feel like the readings today would have been the text given to us to answer the ordination exam question, why did Jesus come to earth? These are the readings for the Feast of the Epiphany, where we talk about Jesus having arrived upon earth, God breaking into the world, and wise men being given a sign to go find him, and evil rising up to say, we got to kill that guy before he lets God get out into this world. What do the readings say? The prophet Isaiah from chapter 40 on is promising that God is going to come to bring righteousness and peace to the world, not just to save us when we die, but to bring righteousness and peace to the people who need it. It says, arise, shine, for your light has come. And it says, open your eyes and look around you. Your sons and your daughters are coming back. The nations will be brought to you. He means you'll have your country, you'll have your home, you'll have your family, literally, physically upon earth. And then Psalm 72 makes it more abundantly clear. It speaks of righteousness and peace. It says the poor and the oppressed will be rescued, and the oppressor will be crushed. This is a common theme in the Bible. Paul goes one step further, because now we're in the time of the New Testament where Christ has lived out his entire ministry upon earth and has been crucified and resurrected, and now Paul is coming onto the scene as he calls himself, the least of the servants, ordained by God to preach about the bountiful riches of Christ's grace. And then what is the church going to do? The church is going to show the wisdom of God to the rulers, the powers, and the authorities in the heavenly places. That's what it says. Well, in the heavenly places does not mean the powers and authorities up in heaven. It means the rulers and authorities here on earth who are being affected by powers out there, angelic, divine, and demonic. So the wisdom of God, that is Jesus, is going to speak to the rulers and authorities of the world. And look what happens when Herod even gets a whiff of the birth of a baby who's going to be the new king of Israel. Look what happens to that 2-bit tyrant. All of his power is due to his army, and he's subjugated the entire nation of Israel, and he's terrified by a baby. And for some reason, so is all of Jerusalem, because they got a good thing going. They've made their arrangements with the Roman occupiers, and they're going to be safe as long as nobody rocks the boat. And yet, Jesus came as the wisdom of God to speak to the powers and authorities of the world, both the ones doing good and the ones not doing good, the oppressors. I have been thinking a great deal about Archbishop Desmond Tutu because he died quite recently, and he has always been a model for me of the priesthood. You may think of him as the Nobel Prize winner, but he was a priest first, and then a bishop, and then an archbishop, and he became known worldwide for his work to liberate South Africa from apartheid. So I read a lot about Archbishop Tutu in the past week. I read a biography of him and then some of his book, No Future Without Forgiveness. And I learned more about this man, born in the 1930s in South Africa, right at the time when the white minority government had instituted a bunch of laws that basically made it illegal to do a bunch of things if you were black. Illegal to be part of a political party, illegal to protest against the government, illegal to write in the press about the government in a negative way. If you did that, you didn't get to show up at the next event that the government was having. They created apartheid, which means apartness, the apartness of the races, to separate the races in South Africa. The 20% white people who were mostly Dutch Boer immigrants, came from Dutch missionaries, and the 80% black population. They made it impossible for black people to work in certain professions, like they couldn't work in the government. It was very difficult to become things like lawyers or doctors. There were a few, but it was harder to do. And Desmond Tutu's father was a school principal, and so was very concerned about education and the quality of education. So Desmond Tutu got the best education that you could get in South Africa if you were black, mainly from missionary churches, Methodist and Anglican, that is Episcopal, missionary schools. However, by the 1950s, he was becoming a teacher. That was his first vocation, to become a teacher like his father. He met his wife in Teachers College, and right as they were beginning their careers as school teachers, they started another law in South Africa in 1953 called the Bantu Education Act, later renamed the Black Education Act. This was right before the year of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which made racial segregation in schools illegal in the United States. But South Africa was looking at the United States saying, we've got an idea, let's segregate the schools. So they segregated the schools, which had not been previously segregated completely, and they removed funding from black education. They made the teaching salaries of black teachers 1/10 of the teaching salaries of white teachers in South Africa. They destroyed the curriculum. So the South African curriculum for everybody had been what we would call the Western curriculum: math, science, the liberal arts, art, and so on. But what they decided was that since black people were only going to be allowed to be laborers, there was no reason to teach them, say, math and science and literature, to give them a quote-unquote vocational education. As one of the interior ministers said, there's no reason to teach them math, they're never going to use it. This happened right when Desmond and his wife were starting to teach. They quit teaching, partly for the reason you might suspect, that they found it appalling that they wouldn't be allowed to teach children what they needed to know, but also because he could not afford to raise a family on the salary. So he looked around and he said, well, I went to missionary school. He was very impressed by a white Anglican priest named Trevor Huddleston, who was deeply opposed to apartheid and protested against the government all the time. And he went to him and he said, I need a job. Could I be a priest? He felt no calling to the priesthood. He felt no interest in Jesus. He needed a job. He was the smartest kid in his class, and they said, sure, we'll send you to seminary. While at seminary, he was deeply affected by the monks who were at the Community of the Resurrection. And so, like all seminarians, we have to get up very early and go to church every morning, and then prayer services throughout the day, and then, kind of one would expect we might pray at some point in our lives as well. And so you do a lot of church and prayer in seminary, hopefully. And that's what happened to him. And he was deeply affected by seeing monks praying for hours a day. So he prayed. He started praying for hours a day. And then all of a sudden, Desmond Tutu was interested in being a priest so that he could share the bountiful riches of God's grace, as Paul was moved to do. He said, at the time, I was not at all interested in the political, even though all the things that were happening in South Africa, all the various political repressions and violence against black people were happening at the time, but he said, I wasn't interested. He hated the political repression. He hated things that were done to him and his family, but wasn't really interested in getting involved. Well, then they wanted to provide more theological teachers in South Africa, and because Desmond Tutu was so brilliant, they decided to send him to England and his whole family to England to go to the theology college at King's College London and get the equivalent of a Master's of Divinity. For 3 years he studied, and while there, he served for 2 all-white churches. Now he said, send me to an inner-city black church, and they said no. Both times they sent him to an all-white church. So he and his family got to live in England for the first time. His 4th and last child was born in England. And while in England, an amazing transformation happened to him. He was treated with equal dignity and respect as a black man, and he had never had that treatment from a white person in South Africa. He said that when he and his wife were walking around in London, they would often ask the police officers for directions because the police officers would call them sir and madam. And he didn't do it to taunt the police officers, but because it was so transformative to have a white man treat him and his wife with respect. And he said that he learned to lose the deference that he'd been forced to show to white people, that white people were automatically superior and better and to be treated with more respect. He learned how to see white people as his equals and also to minister to white people. And the people in England were equally grateful to have him there because they knew what was going on in South Africa and they wanted to help to be part of the solution to the problem. When they returned to South Africa, he was made a priest and then later educated or elected as a bishop. But the problem was his family had had freedom, the children had had fantastic education, and all of a sudden they returned to South Africa where the children were put in schools where they would learn nothing. And he was living in very degraded conditions, making 2/3 of what a white priest would make. Eventually those conditions would change. They'd send their children to boarding schools. And then all of a sudden, remember in the 1960s, all of the political leaders, black political leaders of any black party in South Africa were put in prison, detained without trial, just because the white people in power could do it. And so there they were, breaking rocks, stashed away forever. And Desmond Tutu found himself in these situations. So, for example, he was made the head of a theological college, and across the street from this theological college called Federated Seminary was another historically black university in South Africa. And the students were protesting the poor conditions, the lack of plumbing, the lack of heating, the lack of books, the lack of instructors at their college, basically no curriculum again. So they came to protest nonviolently to the dean of the university, and the police came out and armored vehicles came out and pointed guns at them. And Desmond Tutu and other clergy, it was a multi-denominational seminary, white and black clergy ran across the street, stood between the students and the police, knelt down and prayed. They didn't shoot any students that day, but they shot a lot of students later. He also worked on the other side of the conflict. There were a lot of black nationalists who were saying, nonviolence is not going to get us anywhere, Mr. Priest. We're going to use violence. And one of the forms of violence they wanted to use was to kill black informers. I won't describe how they did it, but it was a pretty gruesome way. And so Desmond Tutu stopped a number of those killings as well. One time a man was thrown on the ground. He was believed to be an informer. He wasn't going to get a trial either, and people were pouring gasoline on him. And Desmond Tutu ran over to the man and threw himself on top of the man's body and said, "Stop." That was Desmond Tutu. He became more and more emboldened because he was trying to convince the government and the protesters to come about to a nonviolent Christian resolution to the problems in their country, to get rid of all the racist laws that were holding down all the black people in the country. And he was frequently accused by the white government leaders, by church leaders in general, of being a political activist instead of a priest, a social justice priest. And he said, I don't want to be doing this work, but you put all the political activists in prison, so I have to do it because somebody has to tell you that what you are doing is morally wrong. But to the other side, the side that said, that's it, let's make some bombs, let's throw some gasoline in the buildings, let's burn them up. And he said, no, we're not doing that either. And they didn't like him. He got death threats. His life was in danger from the more militant black political groups, because they were tired of waiting for justice to come. And so they claimed that he was on the side of the informers, that he was siding with the white government. Here was this poor man standing in between, just trying to bring the wisdom of God to the rulers and authorities of the world. Now, where you probably become aware of the story is when he wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984 for his amazing work throughout the world, to let the world know what was happening and to get the world to work upon South Africa. Well, how do you get another nation to change its laws? You suck the money out of them. So he figured that out, and he tried to urge the United States to divest itself. Now that is when I first met Desmond Tutu, because I was in a master's program at the UC Davis, and he came to ask the University of California to divest its investments, to divest from South Africa, to start pulling money out of South Africa so that they couldn't afford to keep doing what they were doing. And we were asked to protest and to strike our classes, like anybody cares that we're not going to our classes. But that's what I did. I did not go to classes. I did a sit-in. I wasn't in the administration building, but we all sat kind of in a big walkway outside the main administration building and protested for the University of California to divest. And it did in 1988. Then he went to visit President Ronald Reagan, and President Reagan was very impressed by Archbishop Tutu, but he did not agree. Bishop Tutu wanted him to stop what President Reagan was calling constructive engagement, that is, sort of diplomatic pleadings with South Africa to stop doing what it was doing, because by this time there was all sorts of violence happening to the people in South Africa. Congress passed a law anyway saying that the United States would stop investing in South Africa and would have economic sanctions against South Africa. President Reagan vetoed it. The Republican majority Congress overrode his veto. Now, we don't remember this because it's been a few years in this country, but that used to happen. It used to be that both sides of the aisle used to get together on certain issues that were so morally clear that it didn't matter where people stood, politically speaking. They would get together. And very soon after the United States voted to stop supporting South Africa financially, in fact, to harm them financially if necessary, very soon after that, President Botha, known as the crocodile, stepped down, and President de Klerk came into power. Nobody, according to this biography of Tutu, nobody knew what de Klerk was going to do. He had a reputation for being a conservative. He supported every anti-black law there was in the country. And yet, a few months after he came into power, he held a press conference. He was going to speak in front of their parliament or whatever it's called, ordered the reporters into the room, gave him his transcript and said, "You can read it, but you can't tell anybody what I'm going to say." And then 30 minutes later, he struck down every single racist law in the country. He stopped outlawing political parties, the black political parties, or any political parties. He ordered the imminent release of all political prisoners, including Nelson Mandela. He got rid of the Black Education Act. He reinstituted freedom of the press, all the things they'd had. In one fell swoop. And that was a white man who had everything to lose. Now, how could something like that happen? Except that the wisdom of God worked upon the rulers and authorities of the world to change it for the better. And the transfer of power was utterly peaceful. Nelson Mandela was released. There were threats of violence and damage and all that, but very little of that happened. Instead, a few years later, there were peaceful elections. Nelson Mandela became president, de Klerk being one of his vice presidents, one of his associates in government. It was a jointly led white and black government, peacefully done. Now, if God wasn't in that, I don't know where God could be in the world. I've been thinking about him a lot because as I approached the anniversary of my own ordination, I kept thinking about this label that has been attached to me sometimes in the past few years, and the label is that I am a quote-unquote social justice priest. And whenever I've heard that label, I've always thought in my mind, no, I'm not. I'm just a regular priest. When I first was called to the priesthood, Sitting in those aisles at my Catholic church, looking up there when I was 10 years old, I kept looking at the priest in the robe who was up there consecrating the bread and the wine, and I said, I am supposed to do that. I knew it from the time I was a little girl. I used to, at 6 years old, I'd stand in front of the mirror and say the Eucharistic prayer and give little pieces of bread to my neighbors. That's what I was supposed to do. Not have anything to do with anything that might be perceived as political. Not at all. I had experienced the bountiful riches of Christ's grace in my life in so many different ways, and I wanted other people to know about it. That's why I became a priest. And yet, things kept happening in the world. There was an earthquake in Haiti while I was in seminary, and so, everybody at seminary was worried about, like, when they'd be bishop or something. I'm like, you guys, people are starving in Haiti. They have no food, no water. We got to do something. So we had a fast for Haiti, and I said, we'll fast. You give us money for fasting. And we raised $5,000 in a week. That's a lot for seminarians. $5,000 is a lot of money for seminarians. And yet, I wanted to preach about, these great German white theologians, Karl Barth and Karl Rahner, and I was so brainy. That's what I was going to preach about. And then Trayvon Martin was killed, and nothing happened to the guy who killed him. And so I was preaching the next Sunday in a historically black church in New Haven, and I said, we have to do something. We have to march to say that you can't kill a 16-year-old with a bag of Skittles in his hands and get away with it. And the next week, people marched throughout New Haven, Connecticut, and went to City Hall demanding justice. And yet, I just wanted to talk about Jesus and how he loves us and how he saves us and the bountiful riches of his grace are transforming us. But stuff kept happening in the world. I was called to the Peace and Justice Church as All Saints Pasadena, and that was the first church that I worked for full-time. Peace and Justice Church. And I only preached about 3 times a year, so really I wasn't affecting the preaching much. But almost every other sermon said at that church addressed some social issue. So when I got there, I thought maybe I should talk about the bountiful riches of Christ's grace because the others aren't. So I would. But then, when I was speaking to the search committee at this church, when you were looking for a new rector, the search committee was quite clear. They said, we want a priest who is going to address the issues of our day. We want a priest who's going to relate the Gospels to what is happening in our world. And I said, you got it. And yet, what happened was that not everybody in the church knew that. And so what happened is whenever I preached something that you might call a social justice sermon, that I brought up some issues such as, gun violence in schools or racism or poverty, I would hear about the complaints of the people who said, couldn't you just talk about how to be a good person or how to love Jesus? I'm like, I think. How to be a good person is to take care of the poor and the oppressed, to speak about the wisdom of God to the rulers and authorities of our world. Isn't that what it means to be Christian? So I found myself somewhat jostled. How do I feed this congregation that says, please don't talk about those things? Well, I think you've noticed that I've sought a balance, that I've tried to talk about these things and a variety of other things. I've probably preached about evangelism far more than I've talked about any single social issue in this church. And yet, still the label, social justice priest. When I was in the bishop search process in Northern California, in the Diocese of El Camino Real, we would do these walkabouts. And so all 5 candidates would be split up among various groups of people, 5 venues in the night, and you would each move from room to room answering the same questions, like this room would be about liturgy, this room would be about whatever, this room would be about social justice. And then afterwards, we'd have like a big coffee hour. You'd be like in a big parish hall, and people would come up and ask you more questions. And after one of these sessions, a group of young adults ran up to me and said, "You're the social justice priest." And I said, "Oh, don't say that. Don't say that. Why not? Look at Archbishop Tutu, probably the most famous Anglican priest in the world. Would you not call that guy a social justice priest? Out of all the things he's done, and yet the man spent hours a day in prayer, hours a day, closer to Jesus than most of us. He threw his body on top of people they were about to kill. You can't be closer to Jesus than that. And yet what he's known for is social justice. So I should aspire to be a social justice priest. I should aspire to be a social justice Christian. Why would we not want to be labeled a social justice Christian?